Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful Thursday afternoon. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Apologize about the short delay. But my name is Dina Klimkina, and I am the Program Manager of our Disability Employment Policy portfolio here at the Council of State Governments. I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Council of State Governments National Conference Reimagined. Today is our sixth and final event in our 8830 celebration series. So far, we've talked about the history of the ADA, the potential impact of automation and technologies, and how states can help youth and young adults with disabilities seek employment, amongst a lot of other issues. Today's session, we're going to focus on how to ensure disability perspective in state policy. Before we can get to our session, I'd like to play a short introductory video by the one and only David Atkins, CSG Executive Director and CEO. Closed captioning is available, and you can use the link provided in the chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Council of State Governments National Conference Reimagined. We're glad you're joining us today. As a kid growing up in Kansas, I wrote a letter to my United States Senator. I was interested in knowing what his advice would be on how a kid could become a politician, be elected as a public servant. Bob Dole wrote me back. That letter inspired me to think about pursuing a career in public service. Ultimately, I would be elected to the Kansas Legislature, the same legislature that Bob Dole started his political career in, before he would go on to serve in Congress as both a member of the House, as a member of the Senate, and as the Senate Majority Leader. He ultimately would become a candidate for President of the United States. He was a larger-than-life figure, the favorite son of my state. And as such, I have to say that his inspiration made a huge difference in my life. His legislation also made a huge difference in the lives of so many Americans. His crowning achievement was the American with Disabilities Act, a bipartisan measure ultimately signed into law by President George H.W. Bush 30 years ago. In the 3 decades since, states across this country have built on the progress of the ADA through legislative caucuses, disability councils, and including people with disabilities on workforce councils and in discussions regarding how to maintain prosperity, how to grow prosperity in our economy, and how to make sure that inclusion is a part of the fabric of our society. Well, even as Bob Dole inspired me, I know that many of you are inspired by those who came before us, those who worked hard to reduce the stigma of people living with disabilities, to empower people living with disabilities to take their place at the table. Well, today we continue to think about how can that progress continue? How can we build? How can we work on the shoulders of those who came before us? 30 years in the course of our nation is a very short period of time, but remarkable progress has been made since that landmark civil rights legislation was passed. Today we consider how can we continue to reduce barriers to employment, inclusion, education, and all of the other facets of our society that truly allow people living with disabilities to take their place as full citizens. We know that our bottom line is going to be enhanced when people with disabilities are fully included in the life of our states, our communities, and our nation. So today we have plenty to celebrate, to look back on 30 years of progress since that landmark legislation was passed. But we also can challenge ourselves to continue to do better. The Council of State Governments is pleased to have our partnership with the Department of Labor. By working with DOL, CSG has been able to reach out to our states to engage you and other state officials in conversations, in learning, and in sharing. And in doing so, finding new pathways to expand the rights of those living with disabilities and to enhance the lives of everyone because of that inclusion. So today I'm pleased that our speakers, our experts on the panel, will be able to share their knowledge. And I'm pleased that all of you had an interest in this topic to take from this session what you can learn and apply it back in your states. The Council of State Governments relishes our role in helping you come together and learn from each other. We hope that you will continue to do that on issues of disabilities and on any other issue that you have an interest in. CSG stands ready to help you. This is a time of Thanksgiving in our nation, and As we pause to be grateful for those who came before us, we owe a debt of gratitude to those who worked hard, who advocated tirelessly, who drafted the legislation, made sure it got passed and signed into law, and those who have worked to implement it. Our gratitude is best reflected, most eloquently reflected, in our continuing efforts to make certain that the ADA is a living document that continues to be relevant to expanding rights today. Thank you all for being with us. We hope you have a great session, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the future.
And a thank you to David for that video. So to echo the words of our wonderful Executive Director and CEO, we're incredibly grateful for our partnership with the Department of Labor and the Office of Disability Employment Policy, as well as the State Exchange on Employment and Disability, for their partnership and collaboration in this important work. Without them, we really couldn't do any of this. So we're very, very lucky and excited. So before we get started, I would like to draw your attention to a few small housekeeping items. So closed captioning is available, as I mentioned before. I believe we provided the link in the chat, but we will also have the link up on the screen, as you see. The webinar will be available to view on our website with a transcript and slides. Everything will also be available in a PDF format on c.csg.org under the ADA 30 tab, as well as the registration tab for this webinar. If you have any questions for our panelists or really just in general, please submit them through the chat feature. And if you have any technical difficulties or if you have a question about Zoom, please use the chat feature to type a question and CSG staff will get back to you as soon as possible. As we do utilize the chat feature for dialogue between participants and panelists, we do ask that you keep the chat discussions on topic, as we'll be monitoring the chat discussion. And we appreciate your cooperation to keep the dialogue free from any solicitations or disruptive commentary. We also please ask that you stay on mute and turn your cameras off if you are not speaking. So without further delay, I'd like to get started with our program and hand it over to our moderator and my wonderful colleague, Christina Gordley.
Thank you, Dina. I appreciate that. I'm Christina Gordley, and a senior policy analyst with the Disability Employment Policy team here at the Council of State Governments. I have the great honor to introduce our panelists joining us today. Mr. Cody Olson joins us from Minnesota. He is the former public policy director at the Minnesota Council on Disability and currently is a special advisor with the Minnesota Council on Disability and the Minnesota Department of Homeland Security and Emergency. He is a full-time dual master's student at the University of Minnesota studying both public policy and public health. In addition to being a student, Cody has been redeployed to the State Emergency Operations Center since March, assisting in the state's COVID response and ensuring that emergency management efforts are inclusive of the disability community. He is deaf with a cochlear implant and is passionate about advocating for and serving the disability community. Also joining us is Representative Kim Schofield. She is a member of the Georgia House of Representatives and has been representing the Georgia's 60th district since 2017. She has been one of the nation's strongest advocates for policy supporting those with lupus. Representative Schofield was diagnosed with lupus in 2000 and has since been an advocate for cures, treatments, and policies supporting those with lupus and other disabilities. She has received commendation for her work on health policy under former President Barack Obama and former Georgia Governor Nathan Deal, including recognition from the Lupus Foundation of America. And our final panelist is Commissioner Amy Porter. She is the Commissioner of the Department of Aging and Disability Services in Connecticut. The department houses a myriad of aging and disability programs in support of its mission to maximize opportunities for the independence and well-being of people with disabilities and older adults in Connecticut. Ms. Porter has a Doctor of Science degree in Rehabilitation Counseling from Boston University with a specialization in disability policy. She also has a certificate in gerontology. Throughout her career, she has focused on developing comprehensive systems and addressing social policy issues. She currently serves on several state and national committees addressing policy issues in the areas of disability and aging. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. And we'll direct just a general question for everyone as an introductory. But Commissioner Porter, could you tell us a little bit about your background, your relationship with the disability community, and how it influences your work?
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for hosting this great event. It's great to celebrate ADA, and it's great to be able to focus on disability inclusion. So thank you so much for having me as part of the panel. Also, a shout out to some of the folks. I see some of my peers and colleagues on the phone who I haven't seen in a long time. So hello. Yeah, my role as the Commissioner for the Department of Aging and Disability Services is really all about advocacy for individuals with disabilities and older adults, making sure that those perspectives are brought to whatever planning table is out there, making sure that we think about inclusion as part of our programming. Our agency focuses on employment. We look at independent living, access, advocacy, and education. So making sure that as we're thinking about all of those, both for our own policies and programming, but also as the governor's administration here in Connecticut, being able to take that information and really make it available to everybody, make it easy for people to understand how to include people with disabilities, how to make sure that what they're providing is accessible to people. So that's been my role. I've been in disability policy for almost as long as the ADA has been in place. So it's a pleasure for me to be here today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for joining us. And we're excited to learn about the work that Connecticut is doing. Also, I guess an interesting item that you all have been doing is the Governor's Workforce Council. Can you tell us about that council and your role specifically?
Yeah, so a lot of my career has been about working in employment for people with disabilities, working in the vocational rehabilitation program, and there are a few VR folks on the phone that I see today, really making sure that we can help people with disabilities prepare for, enter, maintain, and advance in employment. So that's been a focus for a long time. There are a lot of great programs for that. There's lots of ways to think about how to make sure that people can get integrated into the workforce systems that we have. And I think the Governor Lamont in Connecticut just created a new statewide board. And we've been working on our strategic plan. They really started their work in last fall when things were going really well. Really, businesses had a huge need for talent, and they were trying to figure out what's the most efficient and effective way to do this. We have really cool, committed businesses on our workforce board. We've got some great community partners. We've got state agencies all together at the table, and we were all excited to move forward. And then, COVID hit. So we have new challenges now, but the strategic plan, the basics of it will stay a lot the same. And what excites me the most about our new strategic plan is that it, instead of focusing on the skills gap, it really focuses on the opportunity gap and trying to figure out how to make sure that everybody in our state has access to education, to training programs, to workforce programs, to childcare, to what they need to be successful. And so it's not about disability. It's not about any particular group. It's about trying to make sure that we can close that opportunity gap. So it's a nice model. It's a nice way to think about how we're going to approach our work moving forward, and a great foundation for us to build from.
Excellent. And I think, you brought up something that's impacted everyone recently, and that's COVID, of course. And you mentioned that you have a COVID work council, or you're making sure that I believe that you're a part of that representation.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us about that?
Probably like everyone on the call, we all have a couple hats that we're wearing, right? So I have my day job as Commissioner for the Department of Aging and Disability Services, but our administration, it's all hands on deck with Governor Lamont and his whole team, our community partners. It's really trying to make sure we can address the needs and the challenges that COVID has brought about. So early on in the pandemic, Governor Lamont and his his team and closest advisors created a reopen committee. Many states did. So we have a Reopen Connecticut committee. As part of that, I was fortunate to be able to work with a subcommittee of that group, a community committee. And again, the focus was really on inclusion. So it included representatives from the disability community, from our area agencies on aging. We had healthcare, we had public health, we had folks from labor, we had folks from various state agencies, social services, mental health, all together to talk about, as we think about our response and we think about both the short-term and long-term needs that COVID's going to bring about, what do we want to recommend? And so to me, that's a great example of bringing the right people to the table early on to be able to make sure, not everybody's going to agree, not everybody's going to come up with the same strategy, but what's important is that we're able to have the dialogue about where are our priorities, what do we think we should be doing to respond to this? And so it was a great opportunity through the Reopen Committee to do that. We also have all of our, emergency support function groups stood up. A pandemic is an emergency. So as we respond to the emergency, what are the communication challenges? What are the challenges around mass care? What are the challenges around public health? So particularly in the communications group, we have a focus on diverse communication, on diverse communities, on functional needs. And that group has been able to do things like, ensuring that there are interpreters and transcripts for anything that the governor's doing as a COVID response, that we have our public service announcements have the transcripts available, that we include different perspectives in when we're thinking about new communication and new strategies. And we bring folks to the table from different communities to be able to address some of those needs. So there's a lot of cool things going on. We just did, we have a Stronger Than COVID campaign, and we were just able to have people speaking in different languages, talking just really short clips, but we have a cool one that we can share that's done in American Sign Language. Again, as a language, as another way to be able to make sure that we're reaching all of the communities out there. So we have a lot of, always a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of things we still need to focus on around the needs, the functional needs of individuals in our state, but I think we're approaching it the right way in our planning.
That's great. With the COVID-19 panel and the Workforce Council, you've ensured a place at the table for someone to advocate for individuals with disabilities. Can you talk about how it's important across other initiatives or other policies to have that role early on?
Yeah, one of my colleagues here in Connecticut always talks about the idea of making sure that we're baking it in, not layering it on when we're talking about inclusion, making sure that we have those perspectives at the table early on so that when you're baking the cake, you've got all the right ingredients. You're at least making sure you've got everything there, instead of thinking at the end, oh, we should think about disability, or oh, we should think about older adults, oh, we should think about those functional needs or different languages. If you don't do it from the beginning, then you don't have as robust a program, you don't have an inclusive program. And so starting with that ability to bring folks to the table, I think is really helpful.
That's great. Yes, I love that analogy. And it makes it come together. If you're missing an ingredient, it doesn't work, right? It can't be as good. So I guess if you don't care, we're going to switch over to Representative Schofield, and we'll have the same question. Can you tell us about your background, your relationship with the disability community, and how it influences your work as a legislator?
Well, thank you. And first, let me say thank you to David and to the CSG team. And, I'm so excited to be a part of this 30-year celebration, ADA, the work that we've done, the work that we're going to continue to do. And it just, I'm honored to be on this panel. And Amy, I got to tell you off the bat, I'm going to kind of use your phrase that you just gave about baking and layering. So you get a couple of kudos and shout outs at the beginning, and next time you hear it, they'll say, oh, that was something Kim Schofield said. But my background was simply as a constituent, as a person that in my 30s, in the height of my career, as a mom, as a working person, got diagnosed with a disease of called lupus. And from that point on, my life changed. And it didn't change because I was diagnosed with a chronic disease. It changed because of the stigma associated with living with an invisible disability. Many of you don't know that lupus sometimes does not affect you on the outside. So most of the time, my challenge came with hearing the words, "You don't look sick." And that impacted every aspect of my life, from being able to sustain employment to being able to go to the grocery store and park in a handicap with a state issued hang tag. So it was through that I realized that this was an issue that wasn't talked about, that you have people that live by all of the standards, the ADA standards, of being disabled, but they're still functional. We are part of society. We work, we live, we worship, we pay our taxes, we raise our children. And I ended up not only getting involved with starting a support group, and realizing when I made a national call, or I would say a community call about understanding lupus, that at our first meeting, there were about 65 people showed up. And at that time, there were very limited, it wasn't even really recognized with ADA as a disability or disabling disease. So we had some work to do in that space. But in addition to the outreach and the education, there was a level of policy that needed to change to incorporate and include those that have an invisible or hidden disability, something you don't see. So I started reaching out to my legislators and came down to the Capitol and literally walked around and said, hey, I'm Kim Schofield. I live with lupus. Do you know about lupus? And started engaging and educating that space. And ultimately, as an advocate working with the Lupus Foundation, I built such relationships across the board that I was able to get my first piece of legislation, creating the Governor's Council on Lupus Education and Awareness for Georgia. And ultimately, out of that worked on a couple other policy issues relating to disability and the Family Care Act and so on and so forth, other legislation that would help strengthen what it looks like to live and just live with any chronic disease, and became involved with the disability community, and ultimately was asked to run for office. And it's the greatest, it's the greatest space that I could say, this biggest sandbox that I play in, but have learned not to throw too much sand, but at the same time, we've got to get things done. So I think in Georgia, we have now seen a shifting and an intentionality of how do we incorporate an invisible and hidden disability. What we found in the COVID space was when there was an announcement made that hydroxychloroquine was possibly a medicine that was going to help in the coronavirus, what you had was those people, especially people with lupus, jump up and say, okay, now we have a medicine now that that we need every day, that has been highlighted, and now was limiting our access. But the other problem with that was that people hadn't disclosed to their employers that they had a disease. And so now how do we create that space that not only is safe space, but that it is an intentionality of recognizing that you cannot just define the space of sickness or disability in one dimension. It has to be it can't be no longer be myopic, but it's got to be panoramic to include everybody, that you walk in a space and you don't know what someone's living with. And so I work to dispel the stigmas, the myths, making sure that there is inclusion, there's diversity, that we are not an afterthought, but we are at the table. And to change that narrative that when you say you don't look sick, I have to push back and say, what does sickness look like?
I appreciate that information. And I understand my father was a disabled Army veteran, right? And so he couldn't walk, from it was heart issues. And so he always felt bad about having to hang that tag, or he'd get those comments to him saying, you look fine to me. And he, but, physically he could not walk that distance. And so I think it does, there's a lot of education and advocacy to explain to people. And so that you don't have that, shame or that embarrassment to access what you need, to be, to do independent living and to participate in everyday life. So I understand that role, and I appreciate your efforts in that area. Now, I guess with policy making, you have to work with both sides of the aisle, and you have to work, and right now it's a kind of intense polarization time across the country. So something about disability policy or inclusion, how do you work with other policymakers to make that a reality?
Well, the reality is that everybody knows someone with an invisible or something that they're dealing with. I can name mine. So, but there are so many people like your dad or someone that you can physically see. So when I talk about policy, I talk about inclusion from a point where we have this, this perspective. We don't know how many in the room are dealing with something. And so if we can take that and put that to the forefront, let's address what everybody, you won't deal specifically, but let's go on the premises that everybody's dealing with something. There's just many of us that can name ours. And so when we start to look at policy, we have to, again, whether it's workplace, whether it's housing, whether it's education, whatever layer that we need to be addressing area in policy, we have to be intentional. And so I come from a spot of intentionality, and a lot of my colleagues, again, as we know, the space that we're in right now, we can admit, and we can at least agree that everybody has something going on the inside that you don't see. So if we can start from that point and say, now, how do we build a framework that's inclusive of whether I can see it or identify it? Usually at the end is when I tell my story of, and then mouths drop like, you have lupus? Yeah, 20 years. How many times have I gotten to the grocery store and someone has said, hey, move your car. Why are you parking there? There are people that, again, we've got to create a space where we can stop stigmatizing everything. Let's look from the value of being the humanistic value, and that the value that we all want to be able to work, live, worship, have policies to support our quality of life. And so I reach across the aisles and we start there. And everything we do in as far as the health policy or any type of economic driver, we've got to make sure that we're bringing all people to the table.
It's an awesome message and a wonderful goal, and I appreciate your efforts. I guess from your perspective, you've been an advocate and also in the legislature. What is one of the most important things that state legislatures can do to support individuals with disabilities?
I think the most thing is that we're doing. We have councils created. There are a number of organizations and key stakeholders that come to the table. We are looking at the policies. Do our policies work for 21st century people? We've known that through COVID, we've exposed huge gaps and barriers that now we have to go back and recreate and look and see, are we hitting those mile and those measurements that we need to hit? COVID has given us a great opportunity. We don't like the way that all of these things have surfaced, but it has, if we look at it really from a practical and pragmatic, it has really opened up the things that we thought we were doing well. And this has given us an opportunity to do better. And so when we look at this space, and, again, I love the things that Amy are doing. We're doing some similar things in Georgia. However, Georgia needs to come up a little bit faster and rise to the occasion of Connecticut. Having lived in Boston and I'm a Northerner by heart, I know that the South tends to lean a little bit slower. But we need to come up a little faster. That's where I come in, Amy. And we're going to get us up to speed. But we have to, and I think, I'm going to go back to that word intentionality. We've got to look at how are we being strategically and intentional on changing the narrative that is inclusive for everybody. So our goal in Georgia is to really bring this to the forefront. All of our agencies are now starting to recognize that we've lacked in some areas, and we're now coming back in a stronger and more intentional force.
So if someone's looking at working on legislation to support individuals with disabilities, where should they start? Or what do you think are some of the biggest opportunities for policymakers?
So I have some legislation that I've worked on. It's called Stay at Work, Return to Work, and it gives people with a hidden disability an opportunity to, we want to work. We need the health insurance. We need the human value of contributing to that space. You know, most of us got, I have a doctorate degree. I sure didn't get a doctorate degree to get lupus and then say, I'm gonna sit home. So now how do I pivot and not only just define my new normal, but how do I walk that out? So we wanna stay at work. We wanna create the work. So legislation of workplace policies, educating the policy employers on what an invisible disability looks like. How do we really change that definition? And so I look at policies that are very inclusive in understanding it's not just one dimensional, but we've got to be able to work with how do we develop the workplace that has a culture of educating the employees so that our team understands that I'm not just taking days off and you're getting stuck with my work. You know, now that we've moved to a telework model, how do we now fit that in for people who are in low wage working jobs? You know, how do we allow that Family Care Act to be expanded so that you have family members that need to go to doctor and I'm not losing my pay, my payday, my pay, or you know, losing my check. There are other ways and policies that we can figure out. What does this look like? Who needs to be involved? How do we move it to a space where employers, and we're not taking away their ability to make a decision, but we've got to be able to empower the employees to be comfortable, to share a story and a narrative that keeps them in their job. And so those are the policies that I look at where I'm working with VR or the DOL, where we're trying to find out what does that space look like now.
Yes, definitely. The stay at work, return to work is especially important now, right? As you know, people are recovering from COVID, and that is definitely a hidden illness that the workforce is going to have to recover from, and with telework. I guess right now, what are you most excited to work with in the upcoming session?
So what I'm excited to work with right now is to really understand, again, help our key stakeholders to come in and look at how can we prioritize. We've learned in COVID and what we've learned in COVID. How do we now prioritize to keep the disability community together? That we know that not only are there trainings offering, we've got to help people to pivot that no longer when their jobs have gone away. And now it's hard for us in the disability community to actually find our next, our training programs. How do we now incorporate that? How do we remove the stigma from the housing issues? And now that I may have lost my position and I'm back in the workforce, I'm now having challenges to get stable housing because I've missed that time and that gap of being out of work. So there are so many areas that this touches. So where I'm focused now is to bring everything together to have a convergence now, and then to start redistributing our priorities and making sure that we are meeting the demands right now, today, in real time of people with invisible disabilities, as well as all forms of disability. If you have a chronic disease, this is where I focus. And I hang my hat on that. So working with key partners across the state, as well as building the structure and the infrastructure that's lacking in Georgia that is going to address these real issues. Today's COVID are still engaged in yesterday's issues, but in order to move forward, we've now have to come up with a new paradigm, and we've got to shift. So that's why I love that analogy of not just layering up, but let's bake it in. We've not done a good job of bringing the right ingredients. So if we've got to shift a couple, let's shift, but let's make sure everything is at the table to bake something that people need to eat.
Excellent, Representative Schofield, and I like how you bring it all together. And it's true, we have to include it from the very beginning. And you know, you mentioned the stay at work, return to work, and I'll put a little plug in here that SEED is always available. And you can check our website. We have a stay at work, return to work toolkit. So reach out, and we're here to be a resource for the states or policymakers in any way. Let's see. Let's move on to Mr. Cody Olson. Now we'll start off the same, just to let us know more about you. Can you tell us about your background, your relationship with the disability community, and how it influences your work and your studies?
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon to everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and participate in this panel today. As we mentioned in the introduction, my name is Cody Olson, and I'm currently serving in a dual advisory role to both the Minnesota Council on Disability and the Minnesota Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management through a unique partnership that I'll discuss soon. Informally, I was the public policy director for the Council on Disability for several years before I decided to return to school. And of course, I decided to return to school last September, and COVID always has this funny way of changing our plans of what exactly we're going to be doing. So I grew up on a farm in rural Iowa, and I was deafened at 2 years old from bacterial meningitis. I was implanted with a cochlear implant, and I was a trial patient at the University of Iowa hospitals going through, back in 1998 at the time, the final stages of the cochlear implant surgery. And one thing that's really unique about myself is deafness and hard of hearing culture is such a spectrum. And so when people see me, voicing for myself and talking rather than using sign language, it surprises people. And part of that was growing up in a mainstream culture. I went to a public school in rural Iowa rather than going to a deaf school as well. However, I do use sign language, and I've used sign language interpreters my whole life from kindergarten growing up. And when I went to Iowa State University, first generation college student, I'll add that as well. I discovered my deaf identity at Iowa State University, where I met fellow deaf people and learned more about the disability community in a larger sense. When I was at Iowa State, I majored in a global sustainable development program called Global Resource Systems, and I traveled around the world to countries like Haiti and Uganda and Peru, focusing on food security and global development. And what was really cool story in Uganda, I actually met several deaf families who, it was fascinating. They each had their own household. In their own household, they had their own sign language, because there isn't really a formalized, nationwide, institutionalized sign language. There is, but the educational system just doesn't, it's not systematic. And so I thought that was really, really fascinating to see these three different deaf families have their own different language to communicate with each other. And I went to a crafting co-op, and this is where two of the deaf women were. And I thought it was really fascinating that their hearing friends were signing to them. And I remarked on that. I thought, wow, that's fascinating that, you know sign language. This is pretty unusual. And the hearing woman responded to me, and she said, of course I do. Bridget is my friend. I communicate with her in her language. And I just thought that was really, really fascinating. And I went home. I met the rest of Bridget's family, and she had a deaf husband and a deaf child and one hearing child. So two hearing sons, one hearing son and one deaf son. And what was striking to me is that the hearing son, they had a choice to make. They didn't have enough resources to send both of the kids to school. And so they had to make a choice, and they decided to send their hearing child to school and to send their deaf son to work on the farm, stay at home and work on the farm. And for him to meet a college student who was deaf, that was the moment right there that inspired me to get into disability public policy. And so since then, I've immersed myself in policy and public service. My most cherished experience was working in the East Wing with First Lady Michelle Obama on public policy issues. That was where I really learned to what it meant to be a public servant and what it meant to serve people. And so after that experience is when I moved up here to Minnesota, and I've served as the public policy director for the past several years. And now I'm in a different role.
Sorry, thank you. That's an amazing story and truly inspirational about how it's impacted your life, and what you've done with that inspiration and that kind of that aha moment in your life, like, oh, this is what I want to do and this is where I can make a change. And I think for all of our panelists too, that you have that public policy, like, oh, this is how I can make a change, right? And so sometimes a lot of people will go through it different ways of how to impact. And you can either go through advocacy groups, or you can do lots of other ways, or become a legislator, or work on councils, or work at CSG. But those are ways that you can make change in the public policy, because it affects everybody, and not everyone always realizes the profound impact an overarching law will have on the whole community. Even though it's intended for one group, it impacts many. I guess you've served on the Minnesota Council of Disability, but right now, if you could explain a little bit more about your kind of how you've been detailed over, and how that's that planning was part of Minnesota's plan, and how it's been enacted.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So just a little bit of information about the Minnesota Council on Disability. We serve a really unique role in Minnesota state government, where we are a state agency, yet we have autonomy from the governor's office and from the legislature. So we are we're an independent agency that's governed by a council of community members and advocates who are appointed by the governor. And our main purpose is to serve as a policy and technical resource for the state legislature, for our governor, for the state agencies, and for our members of the public at large. We advocate for policies and programs in public and private sectors that advance the rights of Minnesotans with disabilities. And we focus on specifically on policy development, training, and serving as a technical resource for our stakeholders. And in our public policy world, we serve on a wide variety of issues. We work on issues ranging from transportation to human services and healthcare, to employment and civic engagement and public safety. And did you want me to touch on what we're doing in the age of COVID?
Yes, definitely. Of course.
Absolutely. So MCD has had a longstanding partnership with the Minnesota Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, because we really believe that it's essential that in emergency management that you consider the whole community that you're serving, rather than making generalized assumptions that can really come back and cause detrimental damage to the communities that you're serving if you aren't thinking of everybody. So, and one thing that we know is that Minnesota's disability community, disabled Americans in general, tend not to have a personal preparedness plan, and and during a disaster, they're more likely to lose natural supports, or have environmental factors that disrupt their ability to get around in their community. So for example, a tornado knocking rubble onto the sidewalk, right? That would be an example of how a disaster can very seriously affect someone who has a disability. In COVID, it's so important to include the disability community, and I say that because I ask you, who's dying in COVID? It's people with pre-existing conditions, and that's another label for disability, whether or not that person may or may not realize, but you are in the disability community. Congregate care settings, adult foster homes, group homes, nursing homes, assisted living, all members of the disability community. And so it is so important that we are planning for, we're considering, and we're responding to the needs of disabled citizens everywhere during COVID. I know stories of people who can't get out of bed in the morning because their PCA won't come, or I had a doctor's appointment yesterday. Having access, wearing a face mask, makes it very difficult for me to speech read and to communicate effectively with people. So there's all kinds of considerations that need to be remembered in a state's emergency response. And fortunately, the Department of Public Safety for Minnesota recognizes that and absolutely invites us to be a partner at the table. And so I've served as the disability advisor to the State Emergency Operations Center since we've activated last March. And from there, you know, I'm certified in emergency management. This was something that we were planning to do in a while. So I think that's what's so unique about the role I'm in is I'm an advocate, yes, but I'm also certified in emergency management, and I understand the technical challenges and the systems that happen when a disaster happens. And that's what makes me uniquely situated to serve as an advisor, even while I'm at school, because we've been able to think of really important issues like, you know, like direct support professionals, making sure people can have the services at home that they need. One of our earliest wins was making sure that when everyone was struggling to get PPE, the definition of healthcare workers had glossed over direct support professionals. And so PCAs who were going from home to home of at-risk individuals did not have the proper equipment to protect themselves. And we quickly elevated that to the state's leadership, and we were able to rectify that and send out emergency PPE supplies around the state to protect Minnesota's disability community. So that was one of our very earliest wins. We've thought of areas we've been working on making sure that testing is accessible to everybody. In Minnesota, we just had a breakthrough. So the two major things that we've been able to do is increase non-emergency medical transportation for every county in Minnesota and supplement the Twin Cities Metro Mobility Program so that folks with disabilities can either get to a testing site or they can go and get their groceries picked up or delivered. And now we have at-home testing in Minnesota. Anybody who needs one can get a test delivered overnighted to their house. It's a saliva test, so it doesn't work for everybody, but it is one more option for folks who have transportation barriers. And we are working as hard as we can to test everyone 18 to 35 in Minnesota in the week leading up to Thanksgiving. So that was a huge win for our disability community, though, in being able to get testing at home. And that was something that we had set a target with the Minnesota Department of Health very early on, that this is the gold standard. We need people who can't drive to testing sites. We need them to be able to get testing at home. We've worked with the governor's office on communicating public health information, making sure it's accessible in sign language, closed captions, all the different auxiliaries that are needed. Importantly, in my role, I've been able to review over a dozen governor's emergency executive orders and ensure that the disability community was thoughtfully considered, especially as we changed the rules in the areas of education and employment and participating in your community, who can stay home, who's an essential worker. We had to make sure that the disability community was considered in all of those different elements, and they were, and they accepted, you know, any suggestions that I would have. When we had our face mask mandate go in Minnesota, we had extensive disability community input. We made sure to consider how it's going to impact the deaf and hard of hearing community, how it might impact someone with autism, someone with intellectual or developmental disabilities, folks who have motor sensory challenges. We were able to consider all those different things as we constructed our mask mandate. So in so many ways, I give the Department of Health in Minnesota, the governor's office, and the Department of Public Safety so much credit for their truly, I would call it a model integration of disability inclusion in our State Emergency Operations Center.
That's amazing to see it all come together and follow the plan that you set up in the past. You know, you have those plans laid out and you hope you don't have to use them, right? But when you need them, they're there, and everyone can jump into action. And it's not an afterthought that you have to think about later. I guess, how do you collaborate with the governor's staff and legislature since you're an independent council? I mean, how does that interplay work?
Yeah, so that gives us a unique role because we do have we have a public policy a mandate to advocate for the needs of our disability community. And so by having independence from the legislature and from the governor's office, we can truly take the pulse of our disability community, and we can really represent what is most important to them. And we get to be an advocate. We don't have to compromise with our positions. That's for other people to decide where the compromise is. We know what our position is. We want the very best for our disability community. And so with the governor's office, we certainly can support or oppose policy and related proposals that come out of the office. And we work in close partnership with the governor's office in community engagement. We set up opportunities for the governor to interact regularly with our disability community. We've been highlighting the very important issue of increasing PCA pay in Minnesota so that folks who are providing services and supports to folks with disabilities are being paid a livable wage, and that they're not going through high turnout. And we're making sure that the governor's office is very aware of the consequences of what happens when we don't invest in our PCA program. And every year we develop a public policy agenda with legislative goals of what we want to accomplish at the legislative session. And we do this through disability community input, through our council of advisors. And so we gather all these different perspectives in our community, and the public policy director gets to work with legislators and work with the governor's office in executing and implementing those different policies that we come up with.
That's great. And I appreciate the overview of how the council is working in Minnesota and everything that you're able to touch and bring it together. I guess we'll open up questions for everybody. We've received several from the panel and from the chat discussion. One of them was many states have created strategic plans, disability advisory councils within governor's offices, or even brand new agencies and departments with the disability in focus to ensure that people with disabilities are included. What other strategies come to mind that can help states ensure that all stakeholders have a seat at the table? Sorry if that's a long question, but.
So I'm always going to side on the point of the advocacy groups, making sure that you're bringing together the key advocacy groups that are at the table. Who's the boots on the ground that are doing the work? When we talk about strategic plan, I think one of the issues are we always set a plan based on what we think we know. And oftentimes we don't have the voices at the table that can tell you what the need is. And so I know, in Georgia, when we do bring some of these groups to the table, and especially in our Governor's Council on Health and Disabilities, but there still are high level, they're not really touching the distinct needs and of the community that it impacts. So I would say that in addition to policy, you've got to be able to reach back and have the key stakeholders that are bringing together the voices that need this type of work. And we can tell you what we need as opposed to what you think we need. I'm sure others can chime in on that, but I just always want to make sure that we are, as a policy making agency, that we are, or a body, a governing policy body, that we're making sure the policies impact the people and that the people have an opportunity to say yay or nay.
Commissioner Porter, I see you nodding your head. Did you want to chime in on that? Or?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think just being able to make sure we hear as many voices and different perspectives as we can. We're one of those agencies where they have created a specific aging and disability agency. We actually were created as a disability specific agency back in 2011, and then recently, within the last couple of years, added aging services and really have a focus on what the functional needs are that kind of level that playing field. There's a lot of commonality, I think, in the needs. There are some differences too, but if you look at functional need, there's a lot of commonality. So being able to not just get input on the programming, but also to be able to provide technical assistance to other agencies too. So we see that as one of our roles now that we are a separate standalone agency, to kind of reach out to the other agencies and meet them where they're at, because not everybody understands the disability pieces and what they're not doing at this point, and trying to meet folks where they're at. We have an incredibly receptive administration for that. And they're, my peers in the other agencies are very, very willing and very eager to get input, both from our agency and from individuals with disabilities and older adults, to make sure that their programming really meets the needs that it's intended to meet.
You talk about engaging the advocacy groups and community. How do you go about doing that from the legislative body and from the council or the executive branch?
Kim can probably speak a little bit.
I was going to say, I would like to tell you, if you build it, they will come. But what I will say is that we all know somebody. It's just having the conversation. As a person that lived with lupus, I literally got up, I called the office and I said, I'm going to make it a goal to call everybody under the Gold Dome, the Georgia Dome, and tell them, hey, my name is Kim, I have lupus, I'd like to come talk to you. And I did. I picked it up. I'm like, hey, this is Kim, I have lupus, and I'd like to, hello. And so I was either, disconnected or whatever, but then I went down and I walked around the Capitol. And I'm not saying you have to be this extreme, but I walked around the Capitol and everybody had a red or blue badge on. I introduced myself. I told them, did they know anybody with lupus? If they didn't, that they now were meeting me. And so you find out where your key voices are, through your faith-based community, whatever your issue that you're trying to address, there is a community out there. Now, they may not be organized as much as you think they are. For me, I put my story because the journey of living with lupus was so intense. Within after I got diagnosed in 2000, within maybe 6 months, less than 6 months, I lost my job because literally I'd been working there for 5 years. I was a stable person. Again, I was a single mom, and they said to me, you don't look sick. And maybe you just don't want to work. So I lost my ability to have health insurance. I was a head of household, primary breadwinner, and all of this. And I sat there in a spot in a very bad space and said, I can't be the only one going through this. What does this mean? I lived the American dream. I had the house. I wasn't living above my means. I had the child in private school. I served my community. I worked in my church. And all of a sudden I got sick. And now, what's supposed to be in place to recognize that this is a dramatic shift in the quality of life is now not there. There's nothing in place at that point for people that live with lupus. And so who else is going through this? And so I put my story in the local newspaper and asked anyone if they were a caregiver, if they were living with lupus, to meet me at my church that time. And 65 people showed up the first meeting. And I was like, okay, this is a lot of people that don't have access to resources. They're not organized well. So sometimes it's reaching out and finding that one local voice, and one voice makes a difference. It just happened to be I was a loud voice and wasn't going to stop until we got the attention. But and Cody's nodding because you understand that sometimes you have to be the Lone Ranger just to get the messaging out and the word across. So we're bridge builders. So we build that pathway to get one side to the other. And I think when we talk about advocacy groups, there are more people out here that have untapped potential than we've even begin to imagine. And as I started working with ADA and we were able to move up the time for being for Social Security payments for people living with lupus to those cases to be expedited, and started to get more of the wording within the ADA to be a little more germane and inclusive. They're just things that we can do. And so someone has to raise their hand and be the first one out to say, hey, come to me if you need X. And I think that's how we start to look for them. They're in housing. How many people are impacted that have pre-existing conditions that are impacted by housing? You may be stable this month, but then you may be off work for a couple of months. That impacts your credit. So now I can't even go get another apartment because I have credit issues because it impacted my disease. So everything is a touch point somewhere. I think we just have to get those voices on the ground and look for places that you normally wouldn't look for to find your community.
I'd say personally, I have a couple kids that have rare disease, and so they needed this specific amino acid formula that that health insurance, it's really expensive and they didn't want to cover. And I met up with several other moms, and you're at that last resort and you're trying to provide for your child. And I think how do you handle that, especially even in COVID or now when you have a constituent that comes to you that by the time they reach out to their legislator or their council on disabilities, they're pulling their hair out. They're frazzled, they're at their breaking point, and they don't know what to do, and they feel stuck. And so I guess if you can provide any insight to other policymakers about how to handle that that parent or that loved one that's just in that hard spot, and how to take that and turn it into successful policy.
I say this, I try to really stress upon people, don't come to me at the last stage. Come to me when you just need, when you're just overwhelmed. And, I try to get my colleagues to understand at the point of we needing to change policies, to your point, Christina, people are losing, they're pulling out their hair. They're at that last resort. So when you have an issue like a rare disease or something that's just not, come to me then so that I can begin to start to pull together who needs to, then what policies do need to be changed. First thing is people have to know their legislators. There's a lot of people don't know what we do, how we do, what we do, and how we can help you. So it's educating folks on, I am that arm for you as a policymaker, but I'm also that arm for you that can get you some resources while you're going through this so you don't have to pull your hair out. First, know my name, and then allow me to know your name so that I can be that advocate for you in this space of policy, public health, and everything else that you need. So know your legislators, be engaged, tell them what you need, find the other agencies and groups that are supporting that, rally around other moms. I always want to know what's in your hand and then what's in the hands that you need to get you to that next level. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that does. I guess some other questions we received were, what are some short and long-term steps that state governments can take to better include the perspective of people with disabilities in future policy initiative? And whoever, jump in.
Looks like Cody unmuted. I'll let Cody go first.
Oh, thank you. So the first thing I would say is, one thing that we've been doing with our Department of Health, and one thing that the Council on Disability does annually is we host town halls. We host public forums for individuals. We invite elected officials, we invite policymakers, and we give an open mic to our community. And people do not disappoint. People have stories that they want to and need to share. Just like Representative Schofield was saying, people are frustrated at the systems that are in place. People are going to come up to you who are ready to pull their hair out, and the last thing that they want you to do is to pass the buck off to someone else. That's the last thing they want you to do, because I promise you DHS does that. I promise you, all the different programs, it's always looking for the next person. So the best thing you can do for the community is to, you don't need to know how to solve their problems, but you need to show that you understand their problems and that you are going to be their champion. So I think that's certainly the most important thing, is being available for your constituents, and both physically and emotionally as well.
Yeah, this is Amy. I agree completely. I think being available, actually answering the phone or answering the email and hearing somebody out, like, what is the issue right now? We try to get, whether it's direct staff from our agency, or we're working on a project right now to provide supports for folks in quarantine and isolation. And my message to them is solve the problem and then bring it to the group. Like, use your peers first. If you don't have the answer, use your peers, reach out, establish those relationships, but then bring it to the group so we know if it's a trend. Because some things are, you know, it's just this individual and it's a very unique situation, but sometimes we find that that's happening in all different places, but we don't know it. So if you create a table too to bring that information forward, that's where policy can get made, where you can inform what's really happening and start to see trends that you need to be able to address. So I think it is about, you know, being available for people, building the relationships, and then once you solve the problem, bring it to your team so that you can identify trends.
That's wonderful. Another question we received was, let's see, there's many definitions of disability, right? There's the ADA definition, there's even workplace, there's veterans has a different definition of disability. How do we make sure those definitions are broad and include things like invisible disability when you're writing regulations or policy?
You want your you want your definition to one, encompass the it's going to sound bad, the medical and the legal parameters of what the disability is. So you know, I think the most popular definition is if you have an impairment that significantly impacts a life function of your daily life. You also need to consider the social model of disability, and you need to make sure that you're considering the culture behind disability. You have to acknowledge the culture behind disability, and I'm not sure that I've seen maybe a different panelist has a good example or a good definition that they can point to, but my advice is to certainly acknowledge the social definition of disability.
Yeah, that's great. This is Amy. My experience with this, I think it was 2 legislative sessions ago, maybe 3, we were asked to come up with a common definition of disability across our state agencies and programs. And that was fun. And I think some of it is, you know, we have the vocational rehabilitation program under our agency that has a specific definition, and our funds are tied to that. And then education has a specific definition and their funds are tied to that. So while you can come up with something that's common language, and, you know, and for us, hidden disability is always part of disability because it's really about the functional aspects, not so much whether it's a visible or a hidden disability, but you also have to factor in those very real components, which include funding, because if you don't meet the definition, then that program might not be the right one. So it's about, for me, it's not so much the definition itself, it's about trying to figure out where is the right person for this person to get, the right place for this person to get services, and how can we connect them and meet their functional needs.
And to Amy's point, I think that's the framework of what Georgia uses. It has to be tied to the funding. So while you can have a definition, you've got to be able to make sure the functionality is tied back to the funding so that we can appropriate the necessary resources to help that person improve the quality of life. So I don't know that there is that one size fits all, which is why you have so many different definitions for each classification, but it has to be tied back to the functionality and funding.
When you bring up funding and federal funding streams, how are some of the states that have you seen effectively balancing the COVID-related budget constraints with the federal regulations and the compliance requirements? That's a tricky subject.
Georgia, yeah, you know, again, Georgia, we've been doing a number of, I would say, innovative ways that we're experimenting. So I don't know that we've come up with that perfect model yet. Again, this was something that was new, so we're still working across several agencies, both federal and state, to find that space where we put some things in place. That's a conversation that's an ongoing conversation right now. And I know that, coming up in this legislative session for us in January, that's going to be a priority on my plate to make sure that we have a COVID team in place that is addressing just the full spectrum. It's just not, again, Georgia's not there yet. The conversation, I'm not saying that we're not actively moving to engage this. It's just that we've got a lot of gaps to fill. I'd love to hear what others are doing.
Yeah, for me, it's conferences like this. It's the ability to share with peers, not just in your own state, but to connect with folks from other states. Hearing my fellow panelists today, I'm writing down all sorts of things that, my staff are going to be like, why did we let her out? She got all these ideas and now we have to implement it. So I think it's about sharing those best practices. I don't think any of us have this perfect, right? Like there's so much improvement we need to make on all fronts, and including disability in that. But being able to share with one another and creating forums like this where we can focus on it and focus on disability, which has some, there's all this inclusion talk, right? But right now in COVID world, there's also, okay, so it's inclusive, and yet there are some distinct and separate programming needs that we need to be thinking about. So it's flipping our language and our paradigm a little bit where, okay, we want this inclusion model, but we really do need to think about some separate things. So I think it's being able to share with one another and hear the best practices and just keep at it.
Speaking of sharing and collaborating, one thing that the Council on Disability has been working on for the past 6 months has been putting together an interagency work group to work with to foster and facilitate collaboration between the different state agencies and coordination so that we make sure that the state is following its Olmstead obligations and its ADA requirements and the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And we see gaps that are best filled by creating that environment in the areas of transportation and education. The Department of Public Health, we put together a really robust agents group that is also going to have a public engagement component to it so that the constituents, the community will be able to, rather than going to 6 different agencies with their cross-sectional concerns, we have a group that can work together because we're finding that so many of the issues, so many of the barriers, it's partially this agency's responsibility, it's partially this one's responsibility. We need them to be working together. How can we do that? And by putting this this interagency group together, we are taking a step towards accomplishing and streamlining problem solving.
I think we've covered all the audience questions. If there's any other questions you want to ask of each other while you got each other together, feel free. Commissioner Porter, Representative Schofield, or?
So Lisa, Christian sent something, and I do agree with you, Christian, about the language needs this inclusion talk, and we've got to make sure that we're not losing that there are separate things that we all need. So it's just, again, not a one size fits all, but to develop distinct practices, best practices for each of our separate and distinct needs. So I thank you so much, Christian, for sharing that insight with us. And, we will make sure that that's something that's not lost in translation. So, I wanted to I was looking in the chat just to make sure that we're covering everyone. And I'm reached out to several people to contact me offline, and we'll have a deeper dive in the conversation. But, like I said, I know I'll be reaching out to my fellow panelists to how do we do better across the board, and how do we cross-pollinate? You guys have some best practices that are working. I can share some other things that we're doing in Georgia that I think we're working well. Yeah, we're all in this, and COVID, unfortunately, again, I think it's given us an opportunity to do new things and be innovative, creative, and explore and discover things that we once hoped to do, but now we have to do. And so, you know, I thank you. This has been robust conversations, continuing to have more of these conversations, utilizing CSG for all of their resources. This has been an amazing organization that has helped me, this council, with shaping policy and looking beyond where I thought it should go and moving us in a direction to helping my colleagues understand, again, what we can do better. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate, and we enjoy the opportunity to work with you or any other policymaker, executive or legislative branch. I guess final words from Mr. Olson. Anything you want to wrap up your insights?
Yeah, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to present. I know, you know, COVID is on all of our minds, and I just want to underscore how important it is that after this conference, after this session, everyone go home and make sure that your state is adequately serving the needs of the disability community, because this is a disaster that is specifically targeting us. One thing that we are working on right now is making sure that in the equity framework of the vaccine allocation distribution, that the disability community is being strongly considered. And so I would encourage you to make sure that that your Department of Health knows that disability equity is very important to you. In Minnesota, we're acknowledging that the community is so disproportionately affected. The supports are impacted. So when we're creating definitions of healthcare workers, making sure that direct support professionals are included in that definition is something I want to make sure that people know and take away.
Definitely, those are some great thoughts to consider and some good homework. Commissioner Porter.
Yeah, homework. That was actually the word that was going through my head. Like, I got a lot to do now. I listened to all these. I'm very energized from the panel, and really, while I think we have some of the building blocks in place, there's so much to do, and just hearing from other people how they're approaching it is very energizing for me, and makes me want to, roll my sleeves up and kind of re-engage in some of the strategies we started, amplify what we're doing well, and try to tackle some of the gaps that have been raised. So thank you so much for this forum.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us and discussing on how we can keep that disability perspective in state policy, and not just make every bill about, it doesn't have to have disability in the title, right? Any legislation should have that consideration, and make sure that the disability is a consideration, or as Commissioner reported, it's layered into the cake, right? You're not adding it on top or trying to fit it in later. So thank you all for joining us, and I will hand it back over to Dina Klimkina.
Thank you, and thank you again to all of our speakers and all of our participants. And on behalf of the Council of State Governments, thank you for your time and for your dedication to this really important issue. And I'm really excited to hear about your goals, your projects, and the fantastic opportunities for collaboration you've all discussed. And thanks to everyone who participated today as well. So as Christina noted, we're happy to provide support to you and your state in any of your disability and inclusion policy efforts. So whether you're looking for where your state stands, interested in sample legislation, or would like to connect with other leaders, Council of State Governments and the State Exchange on Employment and Disability are here to help. Reach out to myself or Christina. Our contact information is on the screen. So we also invite all of you to participate in our national conference sessions moving forward, both as far as disability policy and beyond. We have 3 additional events which might interest you in December, including a session on disability employment etiquette and on what are the best practices on interacting with individuals with disabilities. and integrating inclusive practices into policy as well as employment. Inclusive courts, cabinets, and legislatures, which will highlight how states can ensure a disability perspective in policymaking, as well as the perspectives of individuals, policymakers of color, individuals with LGBTQ plus backgrounds, etc., as well as a session on telework and adapting to the COVID-19 economy. So we can post all those in the chat, and they're also on our website. So thank you so much. And we hope you will take a moment to fill out a survey you'll receive following the webinar, where we can either request technical assistance or provide a little feedback on this session. So thank you so much. Have a fantastic afternoon and stay safe and healthy, everyone.